This curious phrase, drum buffer rope, kind of comes up. It may seem a little unusual. To me, it evokes something kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine or an amazing machine where I kind of pull buttons and or push buttons and pull levers and ropes and things. But it's actually a pretty simple concept, and I haven't really thought of a better name for it. But this example should really explain to you what the whole drum buffer rope scenario is and why it's important to use these around constraints. And it's an example that everybody can identify with. The drum is something that creates a cadence for feeding the constraint. And I'll get into what that means in a moment. A buffer is a container. And we think about it, the reason why it's in single quotes is because it's container. It doesn't have to be a physical container, but sometimes it is a place to make sure that the constraint is never starved for input, that the constraint always has the maximum throughput that can go through. And a rope is the signal that the product is ready to move on to the next stage. So you can imagine an assembly line. So this is like the kind of imagination exercise. Imagine an assembly line where people are assembling things in order and someone's beating a drum to keep everybody, assembling like we're on a big Viking boat or something. A buffer, that is like a hopper that contains my material to ensure my machine is never starved. Just like I have my birds in the backyard, I think about that buffer. I have to pour the stuff, the bird seed in the top, and then it just disappears. And then the rope, that's a signal that the product is ready to move on, that the processing is complete. So these three things together, we wrap that around a constraint. So here's our example. This is exactly what the theory of constraints is and how we break an important constraint. So I'll leave it to everyone in the room to think about what the constraint is. Doctors' offices always set multiple times for multiple patients, and they have multiple waiting rooms. Had you ever thought, why do doctors' offices have multiple waiting rooms? And the reason why doctors have multiple waiting rooms is because of the drum buffer rope. They don't know it, but it's because of this drum buffer rope way of managing a constraint. And it makes the efficiency of a doctor's office increase by leaps and bounds because the constraint is on the number of doctors and other medical personnel. Everybody wants to see the doctor, but there's only one doctor. So we build this system around the doctor to make sure that the doctor never has too much input, never knows where he needs to go next, or he or she needs to go next, never has a lack of people ready to see him. And we do that by having multiple waiting rooms. Everybody goes to waiting room, then the medical personnel deal with your intake. When the patient is ready to be seen at my doctor, when I'm ready to be seen, the nurse will take my chart and put it on the door. And that's a signal to the doctor that I'm ready to be seen. That's the rope. That's the signal that we're ready to move on. So the drum, the cadence that's feeding the constraint, what is that? That's the schedule. That's the appointment that you make where multiple people are coming in every couple of minutes or so. What's the buffer? The multiple waiting rooms are the buffer. There's always a patient available for the doctor to see next. We ensure that the constraint is never starved for input. And the rope is a signal that the product is ready to move on to the next stage. When we're ready for the doctor, we put the chart on the wall. When the doctor is done with you, he takes the chart and brings it back to the receptionist. That's another rope signal that you're done, you're ready to move on to the next stage, and then we know someone else can come into the waiting room. This is a classic example of the application of the theory of constraints that we see every day. It's just that maybe the doctors and nurses didn't know that they were obeying or using the theory of constraints to solve a problem, but this is how we solve problems. Now, okay, I understand. Most people here are not doctors. But I want you to understand what what a constraint is. The constraint here is it's a people constraint. We have a few doctors and many, many, many patients. So we come up with a system to maximize the throughput through the constraint. That's the doctor. The doctor is the constraint. He or she is the one of which we have the least resources. Now, remember when I said We don't want to throw money at something prematurely, and I said I would explain it later. Well, this is a classic case. Doctors have a very high salary. So before you decide to hire another doctor, you better study your workflow and decide if another doctor will improve your throughput. If another doctor will improve your throughput and continue to increase your profitability, then yeah, you should bring another doctor in. Maybe you have too many doctors. If you find that there's one doctor who's never seeing anybody the whole day, well, then maybe you have more doctors than you need. These are the kinds of things that we can think about by looking at our own systems that we're reviewing using the theory of constraints.